Hello, BookTube. Well, despite the fact that we are thickly ensconced in a whole bunch of BookTube events in June, time waits for no man, and we are coming up on July. July is only 2 weeks away. So this is an announcement video for Rocket Summer 2025. Michael K Vaughan's great event is back this year, celebrating classic science fiction, vintage and classic science fiction. So science fiction up to the so-called new wave, which I'll be getting to. This is Rocket Summer 2025. And it has a superstructure. You don't need to follow the superstructure. If you read an old science fiction novel in the month of June, or the month of July, you're fine for Rocket Summer. But if you want a little more structure, the first week would be from the nebulous foundings of science fiction to the 1930s and through the 1930s. So you could read one of you could read one of the classic founders of the genre. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Edgar Rice Burroughs. You could read one of those, or plenty of the other innumerable short stories and novels that came out at the time. And then week number 2 is 1940s, which it was growing. The genre was growing in the 1940s. In the 1940s, it hadn't quite exploded yet, for reasons that we'll be getting to in this tedious video, but it was still growing. So there's lots of stuff out there to find. And then week number 3 is the 1950s. I would argue this is when science fiction as a genre exploded, and for very easily understood reasons, for real world reasons. Fiction had been popular among reading humans for 25,000 years. It's the science part that made science fiction explode in the 1950s, because all of a sudden science fiction started happening in real life. Just a bit in the 1950s. So it took off, and there are a ton of things to read. And then the 1960s. And the 1960s was home to the so-called new wave of science fiction. Now, I have mentioned on this channel before that I think the new wave was largely negative as a phenomenon. It had a lot of authors do a lot of work that I love. A lot of authors that I really like came out with a lot of great work as part of the new wave, whether they called themselves that or not. But nevertheless, I think a large element of the so-called new wave was exclusionary rather than inclusive. I think a large element of it was, well, are you smart enough to like this genre? Are you cool enough to get what I'm doing? I'm going to start to do all sorts of non-conventional, non-narrative, non-linear, nonsensical things, and I'm going to drape it in science fiction. Are you cool enough to go along with that? Or are you not really a science fiction fan? It was in the new wave. It was in the middle stages of new wave science fiction. That was the first time that I ever had a science fiction fan tell me to my face that I was not a real science fiction fan. And that has just progressed since then. By the time that young, long-haired, sandal-wearing science fiction new wave fan told me to my face that I was not a real science fiction reader, I had been reading and loving science fiction for 25 years. And that has just continued to be true. In fact, it still happens today. It happens on BookTube. That people who are enamored of a certain kind of science fiction, an outgrowth of new wave, will just routinely say, well, you're not a real fan of the genre if you're not a fan of this. I hate that. I would hate that kind of movement in any kind of writing, let alone science fiction, which I've been reading for so long and loving for so long. But the new wave, I've heard it described by people, including by experts on it, as largely a stylistic movement, as a thing that science fiction is now going to start to explore narrative forms, and it's going to start to explore literary heft and psychological elements. And that maybe if authors are encouraged and paid to do that, better work will result. Better here being, well, it's a variable yardstick. We can talk about it all throughout the month of Rocket Summer. But people looked at, I don't know, a Captain Future novel. And then they looked at some of the stuff being brought out by the New Age and saw a radical difference. There was a radical difference. But I believe that the ultimate evil of New Wave science fiction was that it allowed science fiction fans to be snobs. And there is, I guess, a hunger inside a lot of readers to be snobs. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know why that would be there. But for a long time, science fiction fans could not be snobs. They couldn't be. They were in a recognized low rent ghetto of fiction, so they could no more be snobs than romance readers could be snobs. Romance readers still aren't snobs, except in their own ranks. Romance readers tend to be snobs towards category romances, but science fiction, no, definitely we have strata of snobs now, and I think that started with the new wave. But I have been told that over and over again, that that's the genesis of the new wave. That's why the reason I'm going on like this is because that's why Rocket Summer ends where it does. And I have been told over and over again that the literary justification for new wave is these changes in forms, these changes in narrative style, these changes in, we're going to start to take this seriously. This is not just about ray guns and bug-eyed monsters. We're going to start to delve into what this really means. Okay, fine. I would agree to that, but I don't think that's why the new wave kicked off when it did. I think the new wave kicked off when it did for the same reason that science fiction exploded in the 50s when it did. And it wasn't because of the fiction part. All the stuff I'm talking about is the fiction part. It was for the science part. It was right around the same time that new wave was kicking off that suddenly science fiction was perforce changing in a way that barely has ever happened in any other subgenre of fiction. Suddenly, science fiction obligately had to change because our knowledge of what science fiction was talking about was growing by leaps and bounds, asymptotically. In the 1960s, we had the Mariner probes to Mars and Venus. In the 1960s, we had the great Russian Venera probes to Venus. And those probes, in addition to, of course, the moon landings, those probes were dispelling the old worlds of science fiction permanently. I don't think people take enough account how seismic a thing that was. Every science fiction, you will be hard-pressed. You couldn't swing a dead cat in the 1940s or the 1950s without reading a science fiction story set in the equatorial jungles of Venus. Or with characters like in the Martian Odyssey, trekking across the fields of Mars and brushing aside these life forms. Suddenly, and I mean suddenly in historical terms, suddenly in the 1960s, we knew those stories were fantasy. Suddenly we knew that wasn't possible anymore. Now, where else are you going to find that? In romance novels, people fall in love, out of love, and back in love. That has always been so, and that will always be so, as long as a species with a gigantic brain and a perpetual year-round sex drive thinks there's such a thing as romance. As long as that's possible, as long as humans are importing their human exceptionalism out of the church and into the bedroom, and think in this case, as in so many other cases, we are not animals, well, then romance is always going to be that way. But think about the mystery genre, for instance. In the early murder mysteries, there's no DNA testing. There's only barely anything like accurate fingerprint testing. There are no universal GPS or surveillance cameras everywhere, no cell phones, no tracking data of any kind. And yet, as those things appeared and radically altered the detective world, detective fiction just adapted. It just adapted. It could just adapt. A character who was not dealing much with DNA evidence in the 1950s, if that series is still going on in the late 1970s, as it could, and some did, that character will suddenly be able to talk about DNA evidence. And that will be just fine. It won't hurt the story at all. The writers can just adapt. But if you have built your career on having rocket ships go to the moon and deal with the lunar civilizations there, the Selenians, or more prevalently go to Venus or Mars and deal with the civilizations that are there, if you've built your reputation on that, if you've built a number of short stories and novels on that, if you've built an entire genre on that, as did happen, well, suddenly in the 1960s with these interplanetary probes, it is being shown to you. You are being shown pictures of Mars. And it is a radiation-scorched, freezing desert. No human, you put a human there in his shirt sleeves. It doesn't matter if some of the more careful science fiction writers in the 1930s and 40s gave these people breather masks because they thought the atmosphere must be really thin. It wouldn't matter. You put a human being on without a ton of protective armor on the surface of Mars anywhere, and they will die a horrible death in about a minute. And so, an entire 3 decades worth of stories, 4 or 5 decades worth of stories, is invalidated. Those stories are invalidated. Fans of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom novels like to refer to them as science fantasy, but actually it's all science fantasy. None of it is possible. None of it. Because reality caught up with the genre. And that wasn't the only way. The genre, the science fiction genre, in most of the early decades of Rocket Summer, is all about extrapolating the future from the tech that we have now. So, never mind rockets. Well, my home is going to be serviced by robots. They're going to walk around and make the beds. They're going to lower the blinds. They're going to go out and get the newspaper. And you're reading those stories and you're thinking, well, okay, it won't be a robot. And also, you won't need to go out to get the newspaper. You couldn't foresee the internet, but it did happen. We're living in the science fiction world of the internet. You won't need the robot to walk over and close the blinds if it's a hot day. You can program the window to tint for the time of day, and so on and so forth. We are, unlike in mystery or romance, we are living in a science fiction future that was improperly guessed by all of the science fiction writers whose main stock in trade was the shtick of guessing the shape of the future. I'm not saying, obviously, I'm not faulting these authors for not being able to predict the future, but if that's your stock in trade, if that's how you're titillating your readers, then what possible allure will be left for those old novels and stories when all of that is gone? When not only you're describing a ridiculously anachronistic future, something that for readers in the 21st century, they can't even imagine that you could ever imagine a future that would look like that. Not only that, but in that anachronistic future, you're sending people to versions of Mars and Venus that don't exist. And we've known they don't exist for half a century. I would argue, I have always argued, that those things create an existential firebreak for the genre of science fiction. So that after the 1960s, you can still have so-called hard science fiction authors, but they will be writing quite consciously above your head. Above the head of a non-specialist. It will be quite consciously not comprehensible to you. You'll just have to take, suddenly, instead of talking about, biopods and electroshock and whatnot, you'll be talking about tachyon fields. You don't understand either one of them. They're both essentially meant to be science fantasy. But one is science fiction authors in the 21st century looking over their shoulder and wondering if time and technology is going to invalidate their work the way it did for Edmund Hamilton. I think one of the challenges of Rocket Summer and one of the joys of it is, given those two things, the fact that technology has advanced incredibly and in directions that authors didn't predict. No one predicted the internet. Now here's where the Dude Bros are going to mention a Russian author who did. Okay, great. Read a woman. But anyway, not only the technology, but also the real world, the real outside Earth world. We know what the moon is like. We know what Mars is like. We know what Venus is like. We know what the moons of the gas giants are like. And not only do we know what exoplanets are like, but we also know that we're never going to reach them. And no one from them is ever going to reach us. In some ways, that is a death. Those two things combined are death knell for old science fiction. So one of the joys, one of the fun, one of the challenges of Rocket Summer is to go back to those old stories and find out, is there anything there that you can enjoy when you can't enjoy those things anymore? For me, anyway, that is going to be the challenge and the fun. It was last year and it will be this year. You just sort of hang on a peg the part of your brain that is saying, oh, okay, so you say you're in the 24th century, but you're using rotary phones. Oh, okay. So you say you're in the 23rd century, but you've got thriving above ground colonies on Mars. Okay. All right. I'm going to try to just hang up the part of my brain that notices that sort of thing and instead concentrate on what I can enjoy from these old stories. I'm going to try to keep my reading corralled for the individual decades week by week. I think I failed last year in that. I just started reading all around. I'm going to try to do that this year. So the first week, I will go from the origins of science fiction to the 1930s and through the 1930s. And then the next week, the 40s, and the next week, the 50s. And in the 1960s, in the final week of Rocket Summer, provided any of us is still here, I think what I want to do, because the 1960s it's schizoid when it comes to science fiction. You have the new wave taking off, and you have all sorts of authors embracing that. But you also have plenty of people writing just old-style science fiction all throughout the 60s. It wasn't until the 70s that that's largely stopped happening. Killed by the Mariner probes, which is amazing. You can't say that about any other genre. I think for the 1960s, for Rocket Summer 2025, I'm just going to read the old-fashioned stuff. I think basically what I'm saying is that, as I tended to do for years anyway, I'm going to pretend the new wave didn't happen. I'm just going to ignore it. Largely ignore it. I don't know. Last year I fell into the habit of rereading great science fiction novels in the 1960s part of the event, and I really enjoyed that. So there'll be some of that as well. But I want to know what your plans are. I plan on reading a lot. That's why this isn't a normal TBR. I plan on reading a lot for Rocket Summer. I'm hoping to do a video every day. I know a lot of you aren't like that. A lot of you have lots of other obligations. Your reading time is far more precious, far more restricted. So I want to know what you're planning. I am hoping you're all going to join in on Rocket Summer. And I'm wondering where you stand. Our lists of co-hosts have people who are relatively new to science fiction. We have people who are old hands at science fiction, and everything in between. Where are you? Where do you fit on that spectrum? And are you planning on joining the fun? Michael K Vaughan events are fun. You should join if you can. They are fun. I'd love to know what you plan on reading. This is not a typical TBR. I don't usually do typical TBRs because I'm going to read a lot of science fiction. Reread and read a lot of science fiction in July. So Rocket Summer is coming up, and I hope that you'll all enjoy it. Let me know in the comments section, and I will see you in July. Thank you, BookTube.